seed he could plant. If he wasn't allowed to grow vegetables in his own yard, then he would grow them everywhere else. Not one garden, not one family's food,
they got a petition to recall
but an entire neighborhood transformed
us.
into a farm. The sidewalks, the empty lots, the strips of grass the HOA never cared to maintain, he would turn them all into fertile ground. And because it was for everyone, because it fell under community enrichment, the HOA would have no legal power to stop him. It was bold. It was dangerous. It was guaranteed to enrage the board. But it was also the kind of rebellion that could not be ignored. He began quietly. A few neighbors, frustrated with the rising cost of groceries, were eager to help. One offered to donate seeds. Another lent tools. Together, they started tilling the forgotten corners of Meadowbrook. Tomato vines stretched along fences. Squash crept across the grass medians. Kale sprouted in neat rows where ornamental flowers once stood. The HOA noticed almost immediately. But this time their letters bounced back against the shield of their own bylaws. Each time they threatened fines, he pointed to the clause about community projects. Each time they insisted on removal, he reminded them of the general welfare provision. The board was furious, but powerless. And as the weeks passed, the farm began to grow not just in size, but in meaning. Neighbors came together to water, weed, and harvest. Children who had never seen where food came from pulled carrots from the ground with wide-eyed wonder. Families who once avoided each other behind closed garage doors now stood side by side, trading recipes, sharing baskets of fresh vegetables, and rediscovering what it meant to be a community. But power never gives up easily. And as the farm flourished, the HOA escalated its war. They hired inspectors, they filed lawsuits, and they tried to smear him as a troublemaker who was ruining the neighborhood. Yet the farm kept growing, and with it, the spirit of Meadowbrook shifted. What began as a small act of defiance was now a revolution in full bloom. And deep down, he knew. The HOA would not stop until they destroyed him, or until he proved once and for all that a garden was more powerful than any rulebook. The first seeds had been planted, both in the soil and in the hearts of his neighbors. But the battle for Meadowbrook's future was only just beginning. The farm was no longer just a garden. It had become a living, breathing statement of defiance, growing in every neglected corner of Meadowbrook Estates. Where once there were unused patches of turf, now zucchini vines sprawled across the earth. The HOA's carefully designed symmetry of sterile lawns was crumbling under a tide of green that could not be contained, and the board noticed. The president of the HOA, a woman known for her icy glare and iron grip on community rules, considered the farm an act of war. In her eyes, it wasn't food, it wasn't community. It was chaos. To her, the creeping tendrils of pumpkin vines were an invasion, undermining years of strict control. The board called emergency meetings, whispering in private about how to dismantle this rebellion. The first wave of retaliation came in the form of fines. Thick envelopes, stamped in red, arrived at the doorsteps of the families who participated. Each letter accused them of unauthorized use of community property and demanded payment within 10 days. Some neighbors panicked, fearing financial ruin, and considered abandoning the farm. But the leader of the movement was ready. He had read the bylaws line by line, memorized them like scripture. He pointed to the section that declared all beautification projects open to community participation. He argued that because the farm was open to everyone, it qualified under that rule. The HOA tried to counter with legal threats, drafting documents filled with intimidating language. They hired a law firm known for crushing residents into submission. But when the papers were reviewed by independent counsel, the loopholes shone through like cracks in a dam. The HOA could bluster, but they could not enforce what their own covenant had failed to prohibit. The second wave was psychological. The board began a campaign of fear, spreading rumors that the farm was dangerous. They claimed rats would infest the crops, that diseases would spread, that strangers would flood the neighborhood in search of free food. They mailed glossy pamphlets filled with exaggerated warnings about unsanitary conditions. They stood at the gates, whispering to new buyers that Meadowbrook was in decline. Yet reality told a different story. Instead of pests, the farm brought pollinators, bees buzzing joyfully, butterflies drifting from bloom to bloom. Instead of strangers, it drew families closer, neighbors who once ignored each other now gathering to share recipes and harvest baskets. Children laughed in the rows of corn, not rats. The lies fell apart under the weight of the truth that could be seen and tasted. But the HOA refused to stop. The third wave came in the form of surveillance. Board members drove slowly past the farm, snapping photos of residents as they worked the soil. They filed reports of violations at every opportunity, hoping to bury the movement under paperwork. Some residents grew uneasy under the constant watch, but others grew more determined. For every picture taken, more seeds were planted. For every report filed, another neighbor joined the effort. And with each passing week, the farm flourished. What had started as a handful of raised beds was now a patchwork quilt of greenery spread across the community. The medians that once held only ornamental grasses now rippled with wheat. The dull strip along the stove drain had become a line of bright sunflowers. Even the HOA's own meeting lawn, once trimmed to perfection, had been quietly seeded with spinach, which sprouted defiantly among the grass. The rebellion had become unstoppable. Yet with every victory came escalation. The HOA president grew obsessed, spending sleepless nights drafting new amendments, searching for loopholes to close the loopholes. She plotted to call a special vote, one that would change the bylaws and outlaw the farm entirely. It would take only a majority of signatures to pass. The farmer knew it was coming. He could feel the storm brewing behind every fake smile, every polite but tense conversation at the mailbox. The board was gathering strength, determined to crush what had grown too quickly for them to control. And yet, something unexpected was happening alongside the conflict. The neighborhood itself was changing. For the first time in years, Meadowbrook Estates felt alive. Instead of empty driveways and silent houses, there was laughter, chatter, and the clink of tools. Neighbors shared not just crops, but companionship. They had cookouts where everything on the table came from their collective soil. They had potlucks where dishes bore the flavor of freedom. The HOA had intended to isolate the man who started it all. Instead, they had unified the entire community around him. But power rarely accepts defeat, and the board's next move would not be just letters or fines. It would be something bigger, something that could threaten to tear apart everything the farm had built. As summer deepened, the crops grew tall and strong, but so did the tension. Every rustle of leaves seemed to whisper of conflict to come. Every meeting behind closed doors promised new strategies of control. And while the farm had flourished under sunshine, it was about to be tested under shadow. The HOA was preparing its most ruthless attack yet, an attack not just on the plants, but on the very spirit of the people who had dared to fight back. And when it came, it would decide whether Meadowbrook would remain a community of neighbors or return to a kingdom ruled by fear. By midsummer, Meadowbrook Estates looked nothing like the glossy brochures that once lured families inside its gates. Where uniform lawns once stretched in silent monotony, there now stood a living mosaic of vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees. The neat symmetry that the HOA prized so dearly had been replaced by unruly abundance. Rows of tomatoes gleamed red against green vines. Cucumbers hung heavy from trellises, and golden sunflowers swayed taller than the fences designed to keep order. To the residents, it was beautiful. To the HOA, it was an insult. The board had tried letters, fines, intimidation, and lies. None had worked, so they escalated to their boldest move yet, rewriting the rules. A special meeting was called, announced with a flurry of sternly worded notices slipped into every mailbox. The HOA declared their intent to amend the covenant, adding new clauses that would ban all forms of agricultural activity within the neighborhood. If passed, the farm would be declared illegal overnight. Every squash, every pepper, every stalk of corn would be grounds for legal removal. The news spread like wildfire. Some residents panicked, fearing that months of work could be ripped out in a single day. Others grew angry, refusing to let the board undo what had brought so much joy. The community gathered beneath the shade of a giant oak, ironically one of the few things the HOA hadn't outlawed yet, to plan their response. The farmer who had started it all knew this was the defining moment. The board believed they could crush the rebellion with the stroke of a pen, but he believed the spirit of Meadowbrook was stronger than any document. He reminded his neighbors that the farm was more than just food. It was a symbol of freedom, a reminder that life could not be micromanaged into submission. The day of the vote arrived heavy with tension. The HOA set up tables in the clubhouse, decorated with stern banners proclaiming "Protect Property Values." They paraded charts and statistics, claiming that agriculture lowered resale potential and scared away buyers. They painted visions of rats overrunning the streets, of weeds overtaking the sidewalks, of Meadowbrook falling into ruin. But when residents looked outside, they didn't see ruin. They saw life. They saw children chasing each other between rows of beans. They saw baskets of fresh food exchanged at doorsteps. They saw neighbors who once lived like strangers now talking, laughing, and sharing meals. The farm had turned Meadowbrook into something the HOA never intended, a community. The vote began. Some signed in fear, not wanting to be seen as dissenters. Others hesitated, pens trembling in their hands. But one after another, the people remembered what the farm had given them. Slowly, steadily, the signatures piled not on the board's petition, but on a counter-petition circulated by the residents themselves. By the end of the night, the board's amendment had failed. The bylaws remained unchanged. And for the first time, the HOA's power cracked. But victory came at a price. The board was humiliated, and humiliation bred rage. The HOA president, whose control had never before been challenged, left the meeting with eyes burning like embers. She was not done. Within days, she launched her next attack, one that bypassed bylaws entirely. She called the county health department, filing complaints of unsafe farming practices. She summoned city code inspectors, alleging violations of zoning laws. She even claimed the farm was blocking emergency vehicle access, forcing the fire department to investigate. Suddenly, strangers in uniforms were walking the streets of Meadowbrook, measuring plots, taking notes, and photographing gardens. Neighbors who had once felt safe now feared citations. The farm, which had been a source of joy, was now under siege by forces larger than the HOA itself. The farmer, though shaken, refused to surrender. He spent sleepless nights researching county ordinances, digging through city zoning maps, and building defenses. He learned that community gardens were not only legal, but often encouraged. He discovered that the land the HOA claimed as common property was actually designated as easements, meaning the board had no authority to dictate its use. One by one, he dismantled every accusation with facts, paperwork, and persistence. Health inspectors found no violations. Zoning officials confirmed the farm's legality. Fire marshals cleared the streets for safety. Every weapon the HOA tried to wield turned to dust in their hands. But the board was relentless. If they could not win legally, they would win socially. They began targeting individual families, spreading whispers of disloyalty, threatening lawsuits, and hinting that dissenters might face consequences in future votes. Some neighbors grew nervous. A few pulled back, no longer helping with the farm. Others grew angry at the pressure, vowing never to give in. The farm had divided Meadowbrook. It was no longer simply crops in the soil. It was a battleground of values. One side fought for control, the other for freedom. The HOA wanted silence, uniformity, and power. The residents wanted life, color, and choice. And caught between them all was the man who had planted the first seed. He had not asked to be a leader, but the farm had made him one. Every glance from the board, every whispered threat, every letter slipped into a mailbox now carried his name as the root of it all. The weight was heavy. At night, he wondered if it was too much, if the board's constant pressure would eventually wear down his neighbors, if the farm would one day be plowed under by fear. But every morning when he walked outside and saw the dew glistening on rows of lettuce, the bees hovering over blossoms, and the children running barefoot between stalks of corn, he knew the fight was worth it. Still, the board was not done. The failure of the amendment, the collapse of their legal attacks, and the resilience of the farm had pushed them into a corner, and desperate people make dangerous moves. The HOA began preparing something unprecedented, something that would drag Meadowbrook's battle far beyond its gates, into courtrooms and public offices, where the outcome could reshape not just one neighborhood, but the entire idea of what a community could be. The war on green was far from over. It was only entering its most dangerous phase. By the end of summer, the farm in Meadowbrook Estates was no longer just a curiosity. It had grown into a landmark. Families from neighboring communities began visiting, marveling at the transformation of a once ordinary subdivision into a patchwork of gardens. Local bloggers wrote about it, sharing photos of children carrying baskets of produce. The story spread across social media, where people praised the residents for reclaiming their land from rigid rules. But to the HOA, the farm's rising fame was humiliation on display. Every photograph, every article, every post was a reminder that they had lost control, and their fury pushed them into the most extreme tactic yet: a lawsuit. The board convened in secrecy, hiring attorneys not just to enforce bylaws, but to craft an argument that could dismantle the farm entirely. They filed suit in county court, accusing the residents of misuse of community property, endangerment of health, and damaging neighborhood value. They sought not only the destruction of the gardens, but also financial damages. If they won, the farm would be torn out, and its leaders could be bankrupted. The papers arrived in thick envelopes, heavy with official seals. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen their names listed as defendants in a lawsuit. Fear rippled through the neighborhood. Some families withdrew from the farm immediately, terrified of losing their homes. Others rallied, furious that the board was willing to ruin lives to preserve lawns. The man who had planted the first seed knew this was the battle that would decide everything. He gathered every scrap of research he had collected: zoning codes, easement documents, city ordinances. He contacted attorneys, searching for someone willing to defend not just him, but the spirit of the farm. Most laughed or declined, unwilling to fight the HOA machine. But finally, he found one, a local lawyer who believed in the cause and agreed to take the case. The courtroom became the new battlefield. The HOA arrived with polished suits and a parade of experts who claimed vegetables attracted pests, lowered property values, and violated every principle of community design. They argued that Meadowbrook had been marketed as an orderly, pristine neighborhood, not a makeshift farm. To them, the gardens were vandalism disguised as community spirit. But the defense fought back with facts and testimony. Residents took the stand, describing how the farm had reduced grocery costs, improved health, and strengthened bonds. Parents spoke of children who now understood where food came from. Elderly neighbors described the joy of working in the soil again after years of isolation. Experts confirmed that the gardens posed no health risks, that property values were unaffected, and that community farms were being embraced nationwide. The courtroom echoed with the clash of two visions: one of rigid control, the other of living freedom. While the legal battle unfolded, Meadowbrook itself became a stage. News outlets arrived with cameras, broadcasting the fight between the HOA and its own residents. Reporters interviewed families among rows of corn, capturing images of abundance contrasted with the HOA's stern warnings. What had begun as a neighbors' rude dispute was now a public spectacle, and across the city, and even beyond, people chose sides. The HOA, once feared within its gates, now looked petty and oppressive in the eyes of outsiders. Their attempts to frame the farm as dangerous only made them seem absurd when contrasted with smiling children holding baskets of produce. Instead of weakening the farm, the lawsuit had amplified its message. But victory was far from certain. Court cases dragged on, draining time and energy. Legal fees mounted, forcing residents to host fundraisers just to keep their defense alive. Some families grew weary, wondering if it was worth the cost. The HOA, flush with reserves from years of fees and fines, seemed determined to outlast them. Yet the farm itself became their greatest weapon. Every day it grew, visibly thriving, refusing to wither under pressure. Harvest baskets were delivered to court supporters. Volunteers set up roadside stands, offering fresh vegetables with signs that read, "Grown in Meadowbrook." The farm transformed into both sustenance and statement, a reminder of what they were fighting for. The HOA's tactics grew desperate. They claimed the farm was trespassing on property owned by the board, but maps proved otherwise. The spaces used were easements, public by definition. They argued the gardens blocked emergency access, but firefighters testified that access routes were clear. They insisted property values were plummeting. But real estate agents presented evidence of rising demand from buyers who wanted to live in a community with such a unique identity. One by one, the HOA's claims crumbled. Their arguments were sharp, but the truth was sharper. Still, the outcome rested not in the soil of Meadowbrook, but in the judgment of the court. The residents could defend, the HOA could attack, but the final decision would come from a single gavel. As the hearings dragged on, something remarkable happened. Communities outside Meadowbrook began reaching out. People trapped in their own HOA battles wrote letters of support. Farmers, organizations sent donations. A small movement was turning into a larger one, with Meadowbrook's farm as its banner. What had started as rebellion in one neighborhood was becoming a symbol for many. But symbols can be dangerous to those in power, and as the trial neared its conclusion, the HOA prepared one final strike, an argument that, if accepted, could erase everything. They claimed the farm violated the spirit of the covenants, that even if no specific rule had been broken, the intent of Meadowbrook was to be free of agriculture. It was a desperate attempt to reframe the fight, one that threatened to undo all the technical victories the residents had earned. The courtroom fell silent as both sides prepared their closing arguments. Outside, the farm thrived under the sun, unaware that its future now rested not in soil or seed, but in the hands of the law. And deep down, every resident knew the next ruling would either protect everything they had built or destroy it completely. The courtroom was packed. Residents of Meadowbrook filled the benches, their faces drawn tight with nerves, while board members of the HOA sat stiffly in suits at the opposite side, their eyes cold and watchful. The farm had been thriving outside, but in here, under fluorescent lights and the weight of law, its future was on trial. The judge entered, his presence commanding silence. What had started as a local dispute over a handful of tomato plants had swelled into a case watched far beyond the gates of Meadowbrook. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras waited outside, and dozens of communities across the state were watching to see how far an HOA's power could reach. The HOA's attorney rose first, voice sharp as steel. He argued that while no specific clause had authorized their attack, the very spirit of the covenants was at stake. Meadowbrook had been sold as a pristine, orderly neighborhood, free from agricultural clutter. Allowing the farm to remain, he claimed, was a betrayal of every family who bought into that promise. He spoke of uniformity, of property values, of precedent. His words dripped with authority, but beneath them was a tremor of desperation. Then came the defense. The lawyer for the residents spoke not of covenants, but of people. He painted the farm as proof of what community could be. Families sharing meals, children learning to grow food, neighbors reconnecting after years of isolation. He presented maps, ordinances, and expert testimony, dismantling every false claim the HOA had raised. But more than anything, he spoke of choice, the right of people to shape their own lives, to plant seeds in their soil, to turn sterile land into sustenance. At the heart of his argument was a simple truth. The HOA had no right to strip life from the earth just to preserve appearances. The judge listened, silent and unmoving. Hours passed in careful arguments, rebuttals, and cross-examinations. When the closing statements ended, the room felt suffocating. Every breath waited for the gavel. And then it came. The judge ruled in favor of the residents. The farm was declared legal under both local zoning laws and the HOA's own covenants. The board's lawsuit was dismissed in full, their claims struck down as overreach. Not only that, the court ordered the HOA to pay the residents' legal fees, citing abuse of authority. For a moment, silence filled the courtroom. Then cheers erupted, spilling into the hallway, out the doors, and across Meadowbrook itself. Neighbors hugged each other. Children clapped their hands. Even strangers who had come just to watch found themselves swept up in the wave of relief. The farm had won. But while the residents celebrated, the HOA seethed. The board president sat rigid, lips pressed thin, eyes like shards of ice. To he, the judgment wasn't just a loss, it was humiliation in the brightest spotlight. She had built her reputation on control, and now her authority lay shattered at her feet. The days that followed were unlike anything Meadowbrook had seen. The farm exploded with activity, residents planting more, building trellises, expanding rows, determined to make the victory permanent. For the first time, the farm wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. What once had been an act of quiet rebellion was now a community treasure, stamped with the legitimacy of the law. New families joined in, some of whom had been too fearful before. Even people who had sided with the HOA began to soften, drawn by the undeniable beauty of the harvest. The streets of Meadowbrook filled with color, with life, with neighbors exchanging baskets of fresh produce. What the HOA had tried to crush had become the very heartbeat of the neighborhood. But power doesn't fade quietly. Though defeated in court, the HOA board regrouped. They couldn't erase the ruling, but they could bide their time. Behind closed doors, they whispered of new strategies, higher dues, stricter fines, targeted harassment of those who supported the farm. They plotted to starve it out, not through law, but through weariness. The farmer who had started it all knew the battle wasn't truly over. Victory in court was monumental, but the war with the board was now one of endurance. Could the community hold together against endless pressure? Could the spirit of the farm survive not just lawsuits, but the grinding weight of hostility from those in power? For now, though, there was peace. Tomatoes ripened on the vine, children chased each other between rows of beans, and neighbors gathered for potlucks where every dish tasted of triumph. Still, beneath the laughter and celebration lingered a shadow. The HOA had been wounded, but not destroyed. And when power feels its grip slipping, it often strikes hardest. The farm had won its place in Meadowbrook. But would it win its future? The answer lay not in the soil, but in whether the community could remain united when the board inevitably struck again. The court ruling had changed everything. Meadowbrook was no longer the silent suburb it once was. Where uniform lawns had once stood, waves of green rolled through the streets, tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs, and flowers of every color. The farm was no longer rebellion. It was tradition. It was culture. It was life. But the Homeowners Association had not forgotten its defeat. The president of the board carried her humiliation like a wound. The sight of children running barefoot through rows of corn, the smell of fresh basil in the air, the sound of laughter echoing across gardens, all of it grated on her like an insult. She had ruled Meadowbrook with an iron grip for years, and now, in her eyes, that grip had been pried loose by weeds and dirt. So she tried one last time. The board announced sweeping new policies. HOA dues were raised sharply, draining wallets in hopes of stirring resentment. New restrictions were proposed on unrelated matters: parking, noise, even the placement of patio furniture, targeting families who had supported the farm. Letters of warning returned, citing petty infractions in a desperate attempt to reassert dominance. But the board had miscalculated. The community that once might have bowed in silence no longer feared them. The farm had done more than feed people. It had given them a sense of unity they had never known before. Neighbors who once lived behind closed garage doors now stood together, shoulder to shoulder. Every fine was contested, every letter answered, every threat met not with submission, but with solidarity. The board, once so powerful, now found itself surrounded. For every complaint it filed, a dozen neighbors showed up at meetings demanding accountability. For every new restriction it proposed, residents pointed back to the bylaws and the court ruling. The old order of silence was gone. The breaking point came when the president herself tried to order the removal of crops from a strip of grass near the clubhouse. She arrived with landscapers in tow, ready to strip the soil bare. But when she stepped onto the lot, she found dozens of residents already there. Mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, all standing in front of the plants, their arms crossed, their eyes steady. There was no shouting, no violence, no threats. Just a quiet wall of people who refused to move. The landscapers hesitated. They would not cross that line. And as the president stood fuming, realizing her power had finally dissolved, she turned and left, her authority slipping away with every step. That moment was the end. The board's control unraveled piece by piece. Elections came, and with overwhelming numbers, new members replaced the old guard. People who valued the community over control, who saw beauty not in sterile uniformity but in life, were voted in. The HOA remained, but its power was reshaped, redirected toward support instead of domination. The farm, once forbidden, became official. Signs went up, proudly naming it the Meadowbrook Community Farm. Paths were laid, benches built, and a tool shed erected. What had begun as one man's small patch of vegetables had become a neighborhood-wide movement, protected by the very bylaws once used to threaten it. And the impact reached further still. Articles spread across the state, inspiring other communities to push back against overreaching boards. Neighborhoods that had been silent under the weight of petty rules began planting their own gardens, citing Meadowbrook as their model. What had begun as defiance became a symbol of freedom for countless others. For the man who planted the first seed, it was never about fame or victory. It was about a simple belief that land should feed, that neighbors should share, that life was richer when people came together. He walked the rows often, watching children pluck strawberries, hearing the laughter of families sharing meals, seeing the colors of the farm stretch under the sun. And he knew then that no letter, no lawsuit, no threat could ever erase what had grown, because roots, once deep enough, cannot be pulled. The HOA had said no garden, but the community had answered with a farm, and the farm had won,